Teaching C.L. Moore Shambleau. Multiple media online course. A supplementary course to Seminar on Literature. Film made by Lori Zheng in March 2019. As we can see in the background, it is the mysterious creature Shambleau created by Moore in her fiction and visualized by Frank Kelly Freas, an American science fiction and fantasy artist. In fact, Freas was not the only artist who was drawn to illustrate Shambleau. Besides Freas, there have been many other illustrators who have attempted to visualize Shambleau in art form. Here are just some of the numerous I gathered from the internet. Apparently, most of them are designed as book covers. The last picture is the cover of the vinyl record album of the story told by the author C.L. Moore herself. It's also created by Frank Kelly Freas. Now we're entering to our class on the fiction. First of all, we need to get to know the author C.L. Moore. Moore was born in 1911 in Indianapolis. She came to be a prominent writer in 1930 when she was a college student. But she didn't complete her college education because of the Great Depression at that time. Instead, she went to her first job as a secretary at the Fletcher Trust Company in Indianapolis. Moore married her first husband, Henry Kuttner, in 1940, and most of her work from 1940 to 1958 was written by the couple collaboratively. After Kuttner's death, Moore had a brief career as a television scriptwriter from 1958 to 1962 under the name Catherine Kuttner. She then retired from writing in 1963 and died in 1987 when she was at the age of 76. Here are two of the science fiction and fantasy magazines where Moore and her husband frequently published their works. Among these, The Weird Tale is exactly the magazine where Moore had her Shambleau published for the first time. It was the November 1933 issue of The Weird Tale. Apparently, Shambleau is set on Mars, involving the interstellar lynching event. But this story should be treated more as a fantasy than a science fiction, because this story doesn't provide many explanations for what happened most science fictions do. Instead, the story is mainly focused on the characterization of Shambleau as an inhuman being and her relationship with Northwest Smith. Moreover, its time setting is unspecific, and is strongly allusive to the encountering between Medusa and Perseus of the Greek mythology. In a sense, the story is a fantasy, taking readers to revisit the mythopoeic era. Since the story is mainly about how Northwest Smith encountered Shambleau and had an ambivalent relationship or even entanglements with her, and Yarrow's intrusion and termination of this complex relationship by giving Shambleau a fatal shot, the story is constructed on the triangle relationship among the three main characters, Northwest Smith, Shambleau, and Yarrow. And it reminds us of the Greek mythology where Medusa could petrify anyone who sees her, but she was eventually beheaded by Perseus because the latter could avoid her gaze by using his mirror-like shield. Like most short stories, they are composed of 5 basic elements: the exposition, the rising, the climax, the falling, and the denouement. This story also consists of the 5 parts, where Smith's encountering with Shambleau constitutes the exposition. His further contact with her forms the rising. Shambleau's revealing of her secret in a turban reaches the climax. Yarrow's execution of Shambleau develops along with the story's falling. And finally, Yarrow's conversation with Smith about the creature Shambleau forms the denouement of the story. Put in a diagram, the story structure can be illustrated like this, where Smith's encountering with Shambleau constitute the exposition. His further contact with her forms the rising. Shambleau's revealing of her secret in her turban reaches the climax. Yarrow's execution of Shambleau develops along with the story's falling. And finally, Yarrow's conversation with Smith about the creature Shambleau forms the denouement of the story. In the following, we'll divide the text into 5 parts and see how they are corresponding to the 5 segments of the story structure. To have the whole story, you may download the fiction from the free download website, as shown on the upper left corner. On page 1 of the downloaded full text, you can see the exposition part starting from the paragraph where the arrow indicates. That's when Smith saw Shambleau chased by the mob on the Mars. The second part, the rising part, begins when Smith and Shambleau were alone with each other, and Smith found Shambleau submissively following him. That starts from their conversations about where to go, indicated by the arrow on page 5. The climax starts when Smith suddenly woke up in the midnight to see Shambleau revealing her true form by the window in the moonlight. That begins with the paragraph indicated by the arrow on page 10. Starting from the sentence, "From deeps of sound sleep, he awoke much later." In this part, we can see Shambleau reveals her true form step by step as the story develops. She unfastened the last fold and whipped the turban off. From what he saw then, Smith would have turned his eyes away, and he had looked on dreadful things before without flinching. But he could not stir. He could only lie there on his elbow staring at the mass of scarlet, squirming worms' hair that wreathed over her head in a dreadful mockery of ringlets. Then her head was turning, and the green eyes met his. And then, for a moment, Smith went down into a blind abyss of submission. On page 12, the climax of the story culminates at the point where Smith and Shambleau finally have their gazes encounter, as the highlighted parts read. He had known, dimly he had known, when he first gazed into those flat animal shallows, that behind them lay this, all beauty and terror, all horror and delight, in the infinite darkness, upon which her eyes opened like windows, paned with emerald glass. And finally Smith heard Shambleau said slowly, softly, passionately, and erotically, "I shall speak to you now in my own tongue, O beloved." This is also the exact moment when Smith and Shambleau reach their full communications, beyond words, beyond the blocks of language differences. The following part begins from the paragraph indicated by the arrow on page 13. That's when Yarrow finally made his presence in the story. On page 15, the following part reaches its end when Yarrow finally shot Shambleau. The highlighted area is the deadly part reminding us of the classical moment when Medusa was beheaded by Perseus. Hence, it deserves our word-by-word reading here. He stamped and kicked and stamped again, and for one instant he was free of the slimy grip as the bruised form curled back from his heavy feet, and he lurched away dizzily, sick with the revulsion and despair as he fought off the coils, and then he lifted his eyes and saw the cracked mirror on the wall. Dimly in its reflection, he could see the wreathing scar hollow behind him, cat-face peering out with its demure girl smile, dreadfully human, and all the red tendrils reaching after him. And remembrance of something he had read long ago swept incongruously over him, and the gasp of relief and hope that he gave shook for a moment the grip of that command in his brain. Without pausing for a breath, he swung the gun over his shoulder. the reflected barrel in line with the reflected heart in the mirror, and flicked the catch. In the mirror, he saw its blue flame leap in a dazzling spate across the stillness, full into the midst of the squirming, reaching mass behind him. There was a haze and a blaze and a high, thin scream of inhuman malice and despair. The flame cut a wide dark and went out as the gun fell from his hand, and Yarrow pitched forward to the floor. Finally, the denouement begins with the paragraph the arrow points to. This is when Yarrow and Smith will enter into their after-event discussion over the figure Shambleau. It's very much like the usual men's talk about fatal women from a safe distance. It's also like the representation of the mythic figure Medusa, which can be approached only through the mediation of Perseus' mirror-like shield. The most frequently discussed themes of Shambleau include sexuality, addiction, revisit to the mythic origin, language and communication, abject on the basis of Julie Kristeva's theory, and feminism, especially from the aspect of Alain Sissoud's The Life of Medusa, in which Sissoud encouraged us to look at Medusa bravely without resorting to man's reflection, a metaphor of man's value system. Of course, you may develop your own creative study on the story, beyond the topics that have been discussed. Another issue that may deserve our further discussion is about the art form of the story, that is, the literary device employed by the author. As we said in Smith's further contact with Shambleau, he finds himself ambivalently entangled with the mythic in human being. To express Smith's complicated feelings, the author thus uses a lot of oxymorons, a rhetorical device that uses an ostensible self-contradiction to illustrate a rhetorical point or to review a paradox. The literary term oxymoron comes from the Latinized Greek oxymoron, meaning sharp dull, or keenly stupid, or pointedly foolish, a way to describe someone as an entire fool. Being composed of opposite meanings, the term oxymoron is itself an oxymoron. In that case, we can say oxymoron is an ontological term, a term which represents its meaning in its form. Examples can be seen in Shakespeare's plays such as I must be cruel only to be kind in Hamlet, fearful bravery in Julius Caesar, good mischief in The Tempest, tender churl and gentle thief in its sonnets. To listen to the story read by the author herself, you can click the underlined words for the hyperlink. Also other audio versions read by other people on the net. After this introductory course to Maurice Shambleau, you may try to do the following homework. First, writing a plot summary in about 150 words. Second, giving at least 5 examples of Moore's uses of oxymorons in the story. Finally, picking one of the most frequently discussed topics you are interested in further discussing. Briefly writing about how you are entering into further discussion, and quoting some related sentences or passages in the story. On the basis of this homework, you may go further to develop it into a research paper. This is the end of the introductory course on Shambleau. Now it's time for you to have a close reading by yourself. While devoting yourself to the close reading, you may hear Shambleau talking to you in her own tongue, which you may not understand before you read the story, but now you find them fully comprehensible.